And welcome back. I'm your host, Frank. I'm here joined with Anthony once again. And Anthony, I got a question for you. Something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Once again, the political right, the classical liberals in America, understanding that we're in the midst of a societal collapse. And what is becoming more evident is that the societal collapse has been preceded by a moral collapse. I think we all see it now, right? The breakdown of the family, breakdown of culture, and all the turbulence sort of with the moral chaos that has been sweeping the West now for the past at least 50, 60 years, right? I can go back probably a little further than that. But I think one of the questions we have to tackle here is that what I keep getting back to, in America, what is our moral arbiter of truth? Who is here to call fair and foul, right and wrong, and good and evil? Because it seems to me that as Americans, we've always taken sort of this abstract approach to religious principles in order to accommodate the pluralistic nature of really our country for that respect. And so religion, once again, as we've said so many times before, it becomes a personal choice, right? The Founding Father established sort of this secular concept of religious liberty in some respects, where we're not hammered down by any particular doctrine, where every individual can pick and choose their own religion, which de facto means they can pick and choose their own personal moral codes, right? And now we kind of come down 250 years roughly since the American Revolution. We got this moral chaos, and yet we have no sense of moral order. And there's no sense of how to put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak, right? So, because when it comes down to a lot of the moral dictates of America, it's been handed over to secular courts, right? I mean, let's take marriage, for example. The Supreme Court is deciding more and more what the definition of marriage was, which is quite strange and odd, because for 2,000 years, you know, the institution of marriage was really a prerogative of the church. The church decided what the definition of marriage was, but because in America we separated church and state, we never formulated really or put the church in a position of authority. Somebody has to step in. I keep saying this. If you have no church in place in regards to morality, somebody's got to step in and essentially, figure these moral quandaries out within the state of our country. And it's been the secular courts, ironically enough, and they made a disaster out of this. I guess my question is here. The political right, the classical liberals will tell you they believe in order. They believe in religion. And religion is a necessary function in order to have proper order in civilization. That these moral values are very important. And they'll cite the Founding Fathers of America as being religious men. And I guess that's what I want to take on tonight. The Founding Fathers, they say they were very religious men. In some cases, they would say they were Christians. But, when I listen to the likes of Dennis Prager and Prager University trying to make the case for the Founding Fathers being religious, that's not a question that really applies, in my opinion. It's kind of a false dichotomy they're creating because they're trying to prove to their leftist siblings here that we need religion even in its most abstract form, right? My question is, not so much were they religious, were they Orthodox men? Did they believe in Orthodox Christianity? Because anybody can be religious, right? David Koresh was religious, right? Jim Jones was religious. The satanic worshipers today are religious people. The question is not to me, were they religious men? The question to me, were they Orthodox men? Particularly, were they Orthodox Christians? Because that's where I think the essence of the problem lies with America from its founding, and it's why we can't seem to get out of this pickle, this moral debacle that is happening in this country, Anthony. Let me ask you, do we find any principles of orthodoxy in the Founding Fathers? Something that we can link back to sacred tradition and the 2,000-year analogy of the faith that goes consistently back in time through sort of Christian orthodoxy? Or are we just supposed to accept this notion that, they're religious men, that's good enough?
Frank, our fellow Catholic brothers and sisters better strap themselves in because I'm going to be going over some astounding information from the Founding Fathers' own writings this evening. And I can tell you that each quote is going to be more and more interesting, especially if you're Catholic. But questioning this idea of orthodoxy in the sense of Protestantism, in some ways, the question is a good one. And in some ways, it's a misnomer, right? So on the one hand, we do know there were scholars and university professors at these Protestant Christian colleges at the time that pointed out kind of post-Revolutionary War and post-Constitution signing that this whole founding the nation without specifying Jesus Christ was not the best idea in the world and was going to lead to some issues. And when we look at the men themselves, it's almost a reflection, really, of the pluralism. For instance, I mean, you ask a very good question about these guys. And so for Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, John Adams, and James Madison, they all had slightly different views, but you could kind of maybe throw them into a camp that's somewhere in between belief in the Trinitarian God and belief in deism. And then you have other guys that were more explicit about their belief in the Trinity, and especially Jesus as being Savior. Men like John Hancock, John Jay, Benjamin Rush, and Sam Adams. But we've been through these guys before. Like, for instance, Washington would not go to communion, right? Although he was seen kneeling in front of a Bible. So it's like, and praying. And he did this, I think, every morning. So it's very confusing. Like, well, what exactly did they believe? And then Jefferson, of course, we've talked about him numerous times and him creating his own Bible and throwing out what he didn't like, cutting out the supernatural and anything else that he didn't find favorable. Franklin was very forthcoming with his religious beliefs. In fact, he wrote about it about 3 weeks before he died, and he essentially said that he believed in God, he thought he should be worshipped. He had his doubts about Jesus Christ, whether he was actually the Son of God, and he thinks that this God is a God of justice, and, if you've done things that aren't good, it sounds like Franklin believed that, things might not go too well for you. But, I mean, he kind of laughed, and he was like, I'm going to find out soon anyway. I think he knew. He probably knew he was sick, because it was 3 weeks later when he died. So that's interesting. Now, John Adams, we'll talk about him more, but he came up basically Christian, right? But then at the end of the day, before his death, he basically denied the divinity of Jesus Christ. Now, I could be wrong on that, but I don't think I am. It was a while back when I looked up those resources, but I do recall when I was reading through the information that eventually he got to the point where he believed that Jesus was not the Son of God anymore. So he was very explicit, whereas, you look at somebody like Benjamin Franklin, you look at his life, and you're like, wow, but that guy just had doubts. He never explicitly said he didn't think Jesus was the Son of God, as far as I know. And James Madison was very quiet about it. But then you had guys like John Hancock, John Jay, Benjamin Rush, and Sam Adams that were way more vocal about Jesus, and very much specified that they believed that it was only through him that you could attain salvation. Now, here's where things get interesting, right? Because Franklin was the Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge in Pennsylvania, and we also had Hancock, Washington, Paul Revere, and John Marshall also involved in Masonry, and as some of them being the heads of lodges. So where were they in orthodoxy? I don't know that you can call any of it orthodoxy. In fact, Benjamin Franklin helped rewrite one of the confessions, and I don't recall offhand which denomination it was, but as we dig into this information, I mean, it's simply incredible, Frank. It's incredible, just the lack of ability, that we're going to see here for any kind of cohesive idea about morality to be kind of cobbled together among these men themselves.
Okay, Anthony, that's interesting, and I'm very curious to hear about the information you have. There's a few things I have researched myself here, but I think we need to start with this is helping our classical liberal friends understand where we're coming from and what we mean by orthodoxy. I think in sort of this American spirit, as I've said so many times before to you, is that I came from the classical liberal camp. and the basic principles of what the right believes in a general political sense is that we do have some abstract God that judges behavior, yes, but we can't really define who that God is. And we sort of leave it up to every individual to have his own personal relationship with God. That we're not a society that has any overarching principles that we sort of force upon individuals, because in our Constitution, we have the individual rights to believe as we want. Now, when we talk about orthodoxy here, again, you brought it up, Protestantism in itself, from our Catholic perspective, is already not very orthodox as it is. And a lot of this goes back to the Protestant Reformation. A Protestant Reformation, oftentimes classical liberals just want to overlook and avoid or accept the platitudes of the Protestants at the time as a means to find justification for that split. Again, we're talking about breaking with authority here, right? Whether it's the monarchy during the revolutionary periods of the Masons in the 18th and 19th century, or whether it's breaking away from the church and the papacy during the time of the Reformation. I guess the question I want to partake, or what I like to define here first, is that when we talk about orthodoxy, we're talking about a consistent belief passed down through sacred tradition, a 2,000-year analogy of the faith, and really that same faith and theological understanding that was handed down to us by our ancestors. And really, when I say ancestors, sort of a salvation history of the church, where we see well-defined common values and common principles with sound doctrine that can stretch all the way back to the first century. And this is where I think we get into some problems right away, because as the Reformation begins to sort of splinter apart Christianity, we began to see a lot of, splinters within Protestantism. And we come to the Masonic revolutions of the 17th and 18th century, and we see this splintering within Protestant sects, right? Because on one hand, right, they're Masons, they believe in sort of the secularization of government, but on the other hand, it is really infused and tangled up with various forms of Protestantism, right, Anthony? I mean, we've got a situation where the Puritans land here first. They come from a Calvinist branch, right? But then you got your Episcopalian branches that come over as well, too. You got your Lutheran branches. So immediately, the chaos we see in the Protestant world post-Reformation really takes full fruition here in America. And I think this is where our classical liberal friends really struggle with this, because to them, whether it's the Episcopalian God, or whether it's the Puritanical God, or whether it's the Lutheran God, it's all God in the end. Why does it matter? As long as we follow the basic tenets of the faith, right, Anthony? We don't murder, we don't kill, we don't steal, especially don't steal, because private property rights are so emphasized in the American founding. Why haggle over this orthodoxy? Anthony, can't we just find common principles and then move on from there to build a healthy society?
Well, you're correct about that in the American sense of orthodoxy, I suppose, right? Because what you describe is the classical liberal sense of what orthodoxy is that pluralism is okay. Everybody, there is a God. Everybody has their own idea about him. And thus, we should allow for total freedom of conscience and the worship towards that deity, whoever he or whatever he or she or whatever it might be. And that everything is going to work out if we allow for that. I mean, that's the essential premise. And they believed it. They believed it. And there's evidence for this in some sense, because we do have their writings and their thoughts on these ideas to a degree. And we know even from, for instance, the early years of John Adams. He describes a time where he's in school, and there's talk in two different instances with acquaintances of his where this question of the divinity of Christ comes up. Was Christ really the Son of God? Really? Was he really the Son of God? And, at this time in Adam's life, it's clear to me that he still believes that Jesus is the Son of God. Quote, Major Green this evening fell into some conversation with me about the divinity and satisfaction of Jesus Christ. All the argument he advanced was that, quote, that a mere creature or finite being could not make satisfaction to infinite justice for any crimes, end quote, and that these, quote, things are very mysterious, end quote. And Jefferson continues out in the margin, thus, mystery is made a convenient cover for absurdity. So, there were people pushing this notion that, perhaps Jesus was not really the Son of God, perhaps he wasn't divine, and that, well, if that's the case, then obviously he couldn't make perfect satisfaction for all of mankind's sin. And, Adam's kind, he describes this as absurd. But we do know later in his life, of course, that being surrounded by these ideas and being involved with Freemasonry, that he does, at the end of his life, eventually deny Jesus as the Son of God. And we have to ask ourselves, as Americans, where does this leave us? Now, you described this idea of breaking off from authority, Frank, and look, this was very much alive during the Revolutionary War and during the American founding, this idea of breaking off from the Catholic Church, still very alive in people's minds, as we will see. To me, just some of these basic interactions like this one I highlight here, it just shows where things are going in society and ultimately to the end of things that we see today.
Yeah, Anthony, I think one of the things we have to keep in mind, what a lot of people forget, is that the Founding Fathers of America were men of their time. And while Protestantism was kind of devolving into sort of this sectarian anarchy at that time, and we see this really take full fruition throughout the 19th century, the Founding Fathers themselves were reading the Bible, and they had their own kind of set of beliefs, but they were also reading Enlightenment principles and Enlightenment thinkers, while they were reading the Bible and maybe studying some dogmatic, sort of principles of some older line Protestant denomination in that sense. They were also reading Locke, they were reading Voltaire and Montesquieu. And a lot of this is framed in that ideological sort of concoction where we intermix Christianity with Enlightenment principles. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see a lot of the contradictory or confusing or unorthodox Christian beliefs of the Founding Fathers. I'm sure there were some Founding Fathers that were more orthodox than others. But in some capacity, all of them had a problem, right? Or at least for the most part. There was one Catholic there, what was his name? Carroll, I believe was his name, became the first Bishop of America. Now, he's an interesting character, and there's some things to say there. But in general, I mean, the Founding Fathers believed in a sort of theistic rationalism, right? And I believe that's why we see Thomas Jefferson effectively cut out all of the miracles from the Bible. He really got the divine authority of Jesus Christ and looked at Jesus Christ as a good philosopher with good moral principles. And isn't that really what American conservatism adopted? You fast forward to today, we have no true doctrinal beliefs. You're supposed to act a certain way, live a life of just order, right? Because the political right today, classical liberals believe in order. They'll tell you we need good behavior and religion in that abstract sense to create order within civilization. The problem, of course, is they don't want to delve into the details, They say, well, we got to follow the top 10 points of the faith. But as I've always pointed out, Anthony, it is the bottom 10 points of the faith that form you so you could properly practice the top 10 points of the faith. And if rationalism becomes your sole sort of arbiter of truth, where you're intermixing with Christianity, what happens to the supernatural elements of the faith, which is something that we got to go back to the old Catholic world and understand how we dealt with the supernatural, right? Sacramentalism to start with. What do we do with this relation between man and God when for 1,600 years, or in the case of the Founding Fathers, it's really 1,800 years now, and we viewed our relationship through God through this sacramental means, and all of a sudden we said, nope, no more sacraments. Those are irrelevant. Now, I get it. That kind of starts with Luther, right? and the separation from the Anglican Church in England, as well as the Calvinists, right? As they begin to slowly take away the sacraments. And see, that's the irony of it all. We start off with 7 sacraments for the first 1600 years, but then all of a sudden now we have a Protestant Reformation and we begin to dumb it down, right? The Lutherans kind of changed the belief in sort of transubstantiation, and now they believe in something that's a little more watered down. You got the Episcopalian Church, or the Church of England, whatever you want to call it there, that kind of starts to dwindle down the sacraments. And then you get to the American Revolution and you intermix sort of this, again, this theistic rationalism, and now the sacraments don't exist anymore. Now, what have you done? What have you done? You've altered the relation between man and God. And if this is the way that it was laid out by God and through this analogy of the faith for 1800 years, who are these particular men at this given time to redefine what the terms of condition are, what the so-called covenant is, right? And isn't this what the idea that the likes of Glenn Beck pushes, right? And even that one actor, Kirk Cameron, where you just kind of renegotiate the terms of condition as you go along. But that's not what God told us. It wasn't like God came down and said to us, well, anytime you feel like renegotiating the terms of condition, you can do that. No, there was one covenant. There was one covenant. And for that matter, Anthony, that covenant was broken by the Protestants. So that's why there's no separating the Protestant Reformation from what the Founding Fathers established here. Now, classical liberals don't want to go down that path. We can't relive the Protestant Reformation. That's old history, right? What have you done for me lately? That's really the model for the classical liberals oftentimes. But it is important that we define that. And this is why we see such crazy ideas really from the Founding Fathers in regards to religion and this religious anarchy that exists in America today. It's perfectly Protestant because of our unwillingness to acknowledge an analogy of the faith and an original covenant. And now you got a bunch of Founding Fathers. They have a bunch of contradictory beliefs. And look where we are today, Anthony. We have doctrinal, theological, and philosophical anarchy that now sweeps America. We can't determine where right and wrong is. We have no moral arbiter of truth to tell us that this is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is evil anymore. And now we have secular institutions of government that have to determine our morality. Do you understand how radical that is throughout salvation history? Where secular governments now determine morality, right? That used to be the prerogative of the church. It was always the church that dealt with the moral realm. And guess what? The governments of old, the monarchs of old, they had to a certain respect the church. They had to go along with the church because there was a symbiotic relation between monarchies and the church. But in this post-Enlightenment era of republicanism and democracy, we separated church and state. Now nobody knows what the rules are anymore. And nobody even has a history, a memory, or understanding of this relationship that man had with God for 18 or 1600 years. Pick your date right there. And is it no wonder that the religious beliefs of America in its founding were so chaotic, so contradictory, and we wonder why we've fallen off the cliff morally in 2021. Well, really, we've been falling off for longer than that, but I'm just making a point here, Anthony. This is crazy what we Americans have come to believe.
Precisely, Frankie. Let me get to some of the juicy stuff here. So you get into just this breakdown and throwing away the Catholic Church and why would the founders do that, and you've gone over a lot from monarchy to the church and everything, and I think we have to have a good idea of why they did that. But first, just really quick before I get to that juicier stuff, I just want to show and highlight how this kind of Protestant mindset was going on back then when it came to Scripture. Like there's this letter from Mary Stevenson to Benjamin Franklin. They had a series of letters between 1760 and 1762, but this is just one excerpt. This is her addressing him. Quote, "You start a supposition that our Savior's fasting and temptation in the wilderness was visionary, a supposition my mind is very ready to receive. For I have always been at a loss as to what to think about those transactions. The power of God I should not question, but there the power is Satan's, who performs miracles upon the Son of God. Jesus, considered as an omnipresent God, had no need of being carried up into on high to see all the kingdoms of the earth. And as man, he could not see really them from the summit of the highest mountain. Therefore, I think the fact appears to be visionary. Besides, the showing him all the kingdoms of the earth and the glory of them must be visionary, for it is not possible to be real. So, this is that kind of thing you get into, I used to go to, back when I was in college and I was no longer a practicing Catholic, I did hang around my fair share of Protestants, just out and about hanging out with different people. I'd end up in some of these Protestant coffee houses where they would read the Bible and have some rock and roll, like live rock and roll, and read some more Bible, have some coffee. And this is the kind of thing that went on there endlessly. This kind of, it's like, why do you need an interpreter? Gee, I don't know. Everybody just follows their own Holy Spirit, right? They have a misunderstanding about how the Holy Spirit guides the church. But here's the problem that we're getting into here, Frank, is that they really don't believe in the church, okay? So if we look at some of the drafts of a dissertation on the canon and the feudal law from John Adams, we get a really clear idea of what's going on, because he really goes after what was happening in the Middle Ages and what his perception of what it was in his time, right? So he didn't live then, but this is his perception, and that's what he has to go on based on things that he had read, which who knows, But this is his interpretation of what it was like. Let's see here. Quote, since the promulgation of Christianity, the two greatest systems of tyranny that have sprung from this source are the canon and the feudal law. The desire of dominion, however noble and useful on the whole, is, however, when unawed and unrestrained by hope and fears, an encroaching, grasping, restless, and unforgivable principle. And among all the variety of iniquitous systems that have been contrived by the great for the gratification of it in themselves was never so successful as the invention and establishment of the canon and the feudal law. In the former, he's referencing the canon law, the most refined and sublime, extensive, and astonishing constitution of policy that was ever conceived by the human mind, we find was framed by the Romish clergy for the aggrandizement of their own order. So this is why canon law was established. It was so that we could, the clergy could be aggrandized, because, we thought it was fine to send our sons off to become members of the clergy so that they could be the big shots over us, right? That's the whole reason we did it as Catholics. All the epithets that I have given to the Romish policy will be owed to be just when it is considered that they found it practicable to persuade mankind that God Almighty had entrusted them with the keys of heaven, whose gate they might open and close at pleasure, with a power of dispensation over all the rules and obligations of morality, with an authority to license all sorts both of sins and crimes, with a power of deposing princes and absolving subjects from their allegiance, with a power of procuring or withholding the rain of heaven and the beams of the sun. So he just carries on here. Of course, he talks about sins and crimes, right? The church, how dare they judge, Frank? How dare the Catholic Church judge what sin is? We determine if we're sinning or not that Catholic Church. Okay, so just to continue here, because you got into the sacraments too, right? Nay, with the mysterious, awful, incomprehensible power of creating out of bread and wine the flesh and blood of the great creator of the universe. And all these opinions they were enabled to propagate and rivet in the minds of the people by reducing, and he strikes something out here, I'll go back to it, by reducing them to a state of sordid ignorance ensnaring timidity, and by infusing into them a religious horror of letters and knowledge of every kind. Thus was human nature chained fast for ages in a cruel, shameful, deplorable servitude to him and his subordinate tyrants, who it was foretold would exalt himself above all that was called God and that was worshipped. And the part that he struck out there, by reducing the minds of the common people. You don't want to call the people common because, well, I don't know. Maybe I'm misinterpreting that because there's some nuance with language there from prior history. So maybe I'm rash judging him there. I'm not sure. But I have seen this kind of thing before where, at least with Jefferson when we went over him, he talked about using the commoners as essentially bombs and that their minds weren't as sharp, essentially, is what it boiled down to. So this is incredibly interesting, Frank. There's more. Everybody just stay with the cast. Come back to it later. But there's more of this insanity, I promise you. This is just the beginning of how bad it gets.
Wow, that's really an amazing quote, because it really shows you and highlights in what direction religion was going in America, right? Because the moment you say that canon law is no longer relevant, well, there goes your orthodoxy, right? Because now religion becomes really something malleable in the hands of every individual. God becomes a genie in the bottle. You just kind of rub the side and you get your three wishes. And really, isn't that what American Protestantism has become? I've talked about this before. There's something kind of particularly kooky about American Protestantism. I think part of it has to do with the health and wealth gospel, but I think because historical European Protestantism in many ways had to tie back to the Catholic Church. We see some elements of orthodoxy, right? I think the Lutherans get 2 out of the 7 sacraments. I think the Church of England kept a few of those sacraments as well too. They acknowledge certain tenets of this analogy of the faith that went back to the first century. They change hands. They reject authority, but in many respects, they understand that there's a certain function and structure of Christendom that operated for a certain way, and they try and maintain certain elements of that, right? The Church of England has its hierarchy like the Catholic Church. It has its sacraments. Lutheranism, like I said a minute ago there, it keeps some of the sacraments to try and keep Christianity familiar in the light of history, I guess you could say. But American Protestantism, as you highlight here, becomes something malleable in the hands of every individual. And isn't it ironic that post, the enshrinement of religious liberty in the American Constitution, we begin to almost immediately see a rash of new religions pop out of thin air, right? And again, this is not the health and wealth gospel, which we could get into what that is. I still think it's kind of this Calvinist concoction that sort of evolves over time, I guess you could say. But here we are. We're seeing how the American founding, or at least those at the American founding, viewed religion by first rejecting all authority other than their own, and 2, tinkering with doctrine, canon law, and every measure of authority that as Christians we understood how we are to govern our civilization. And there's no wonder that in such a short time, we get the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses, we get all kinds of kooky denominations that really pop up out of thin air. And here comes the chaos. Here comes the moral sort of anarchy that would soon follow, to such a degree that we have no orthodoxy left in America today, and really never have in many respects from the founding. Anthony, what else you got for us there? Because this is fascinating to me.
Well, Frank, I have another gem from John Adams here. I'm not purposely picking on him, but he does seem to be the only founding father that mentions Jesus' name many times throughout his writings. So, and this is of particular interest. I think you will find this fascinating. This is from October 9th, 1774, Philadelphia. He's writing his wife, Abigail Adams. My dear, I am wearied to death with the life I lead. The business of the Congress is tedious beyond expression. This assembly is like no other that has ever existed. Every man in it is a great man, an orator, a statesman, and therefore every man upon every question must show his oratory, his criticism, and his political abilities. And he goes on to talk about how it's basically draining him. Everybody's got to show how smart they are with logic and rhetoric and law and history and politics and mathematics. And so he just talks about essentially how exhausting the whole experience is for him. Now, this is where it gets interesting because it gets into some personal things here. This day, I went to Dr. Allison's meeting in the forenoon and heard the doctor a good discourse upon the Lord's Supper. This is a Presbyterian meeting. I confess I am not fond of the Presbyterian meetings in this town. I had rather go to church. We have better sermons, better prayers, better speakers, softer, sweeter music, and gentler company. And I must confess that the Episcopal Church is quite as agreeable to my taste as the Presbyterian. They are both slaves to the domination of the priesthood. I like the congregational way best. Next to that, the independent. This afternoon, led by curiosity and good company, I strolled away to Mother Church, or rather, Grandmother Church. I mean the Romish chapel. Heard a good short moral essay upon the duty of parents to their children, founded in justice and charity, to take care of their interests, temporal and spiritual. This afternoon's entertainment was to me most awful and affecting. The poor wretches fingering their beads, chanting Latin, not a word of which they understood, their Pater Nosters and Ave Marias, their holy water, their crossing themselves perpetually, their bowing to the name of Jesus wherever they hear it, their bowings and kneelings and genuflections before the altar. The dress of the priest was rich with lace. His pulpit was velvet and gold. The altarpiece was very rich. Little images and crucifixes about, wax candles lighted up. But how shall I describe the picture of our Savior in a frame of marble over the altar at full length upon the cross, in the agonies, and the blood dropping and streaming from his wounds? The music, consisting of an organ and a choir of singers, went all the afternoon, excepting sermon time, and the assembly chanted most sweetly and exquisitely. Here is everything which can lay hold of the eye, ear, and imagination, everything which can charm and bewitch the simple and ignorant. I wonder how Luther ever broke the spell. Adieu, John Adams. Now, Frank, that's fascinating to me because in certain portions of this, he sounds like he's going to be brought in, but he's like, no. This is for the ignorant. Never mind, he spells out exactly what we've talked about here on every cast about how it's not just about the scripture, but the church touches all of your senses. The church teaches you through every facet that we are about as human beings, how we learn. Through beauty, through all of the things that God made beautiful. So I just found this fascinating. But at the end of the day, Frank, we're simple and ignorant. And Luther broke the spell on most people, my friend. Voila, America.
Boy, that's a remarkable quote in so many different ways. He talks about Martin Luther breaking the spell. And it shows you how the American founding, in many respects, or at least it's highlighted here in a simple way, that it's tied together. Protestantism begins its devolution almost immediately. And then when it comes to America, it goes on steroids. Again, no history, no tie back to Europe, no tie back to the analogy of the faith, and it begins to devolve immediately there. Yeah, that's quite fascinating. Ridiculing the Catholic form of prayer. And you can see it there because what they're doing is they're tying in rationalism along with Christianity. And I think that goes back to the author I was reading recently. In fact, do I have it? A gentleman by the name of Greg L. Fraser. who writes a book on the Founding Fathers, Anthony. And he set out on a mission to prove that the Founding Fathers were indeed Christians. And his book, I can put a link up to it here on our site here in the description, called The Founding Fathers Quotes, Quips, and Speeches. Now, his goal in this book was to prove that the founders were Christian, and yet he found something completely different. And this is what he writes here. Personally, I would have had a hard time believing these conclusions if I had not researched the religious beliefs of the Founding Fathers for my upcoming book. The Founding Fathers Quotes, Quips, and Speeches. I examined a great deal of biographical material writings of Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Hamilton, Henry, Payne, Madison, Franklin, and others. Being a Christian, I had hoped to demonstrate that they were not deists, which, with the exception of Thomas Paine, was easily done. But I had also hoped to find evidence that they were truly Christian, a conclusion that proved elusive. The internet has many quotes that would lead one to believe that the founders were Christian, but after thorough examination, I found that most of those quotes are not among the Founding Fathers' original papers or traceable further back than the late 1800s, long after the founders had died. For most of America's founding founders, their religious writings support two primary positions. One, the God of the Bible governs the affairs of mankind, and two, each person should have the freedom to worship him as he or she sees fit. Although this belief are more than deism, they are not by themselves sufficient for Christianity. Theistic rationalism is a reasonable description of the founders' beliefs. There you go. He summed up exactly what you described there in the writings here that you're summing up here, that for each person should have the freedom to worship him or her, or worship God in how they see fit. This is what Glenn Beck pushes. This is what the conservative right pushes again now. And this is not Christianity. It is not Orthodox Christianity. And this is why in many respects, Anthony, I think when we look at the founding of America and what's happened today, I think there's a close relationship to the anarchy that the Founding Fathers believed in sort of their spiritual affairs versus what America has devolved into this, again, atheistic, paganistic culture that we have now. It's a perfect full fruition. Now, Anthony, one issue I want to get to you here, and I want to be fair here. I don't want to slander. I don't want to calumnize. I don't want to destroy anybody's reputation. But do you think here that we could get into some of the, I guess, dubious behaviors of the Founding Fathers? Because when we talk about breaking orthodoxy, again, we talk about Martin Luther and praising Martin Luther. Luther was breaking away from orthodoxy because Luther was a fallen man struggling with sin. Remember, he was the guy that said, listen, it doesn't matter if I commit adultery 100 times a day. As long as I have faith, I'll be saved. I think to me it was clear Luther was rationalizing away of the Catholic belief of faith and working through love and justifying this new concoction of the 16th century of sola fide, justification by faith alone, in order so that we could sin and sin boldly, which ironically is another Luther quote. But I think when we look at the Founding Fathers, I think they were flawed men here. From my understanding, underground sex clubs, chasing the ladies was a big problem for Benjamin Franklin. We know that Thomas Jefferson had affairs with his slaves. I think there's lots of moral probably problems we can find. Can we bring that up in a fair light and say the reason why many of the Founding Fathers didn't accept Rome is because Rome held firm on the moral principles of Christ? I mean, they fought a war and split really all of Christendom, the entire Christian world, because they held to the Orthodox belief that King Henry VIII could not divorce his wife. They were maintaining the teachings of Christ. And here are these Founding Fathers with their own moral flaws, following the heels of Martin Luther, who was a very flawed man himself. Anthony, is it fair to suggest at this point that maybe the Founding Fathers were looking for a source of religious belief that would simply accommodate their fallen nature?
I think anything that is widely known about particular Founding Fathers is fair game in the context of highlighting how we've had this breakaway from the moral arbiter of truth, which is the Catholic Church, and maybe we can get into a cast next time about how the Catholic Church is actually the church that Christ founded. Really, I mean, we're really kind of going after the hearts and minds of classical liberals here to show them, look, when you throw away the moral order, when you throw away moral truth, the real one true church, when you toss that out and give everybody a choice, not a conscience of who they'll worship, because you were able to worship in the old Catholic world. If you were a Jew, you could worship God the way you saw fit. Catholics were going to come in there and stop you. This was simply what we're given here by the founders. I mean, it opens up a can of worms. It opens up complete pluralism. We don't even have a confessional state. This left the door wide open for paganism and Satanism and things that really are detrimental to our country and our well-being as a nation that can function. So I think it's fair game. Now, what we have to keep in mind is that not all of the founding fathers committed those sins, or were even necessarily trying to justify sins they were committing. Adams, to me, and he's a sad case. It truly makes me sad, because as I'm reading through his letters, I don't see a man that was participating in these escapades and trying to justify really serious sin. But there is this level of pride there. And I think that's the kind of opposite mindset that you see within Calvinism. John Calvin isn't known for his sexual escapades like Martin Luther, but you do get a sense of pride there. Like, I am the church. I am going to be the decision maker. These poor ignorant Catholics with their beads and their prayers and their beautiful mass. And it's like, I feel sad for the guy, because it's almost like he wanted to be a part of it. He was curious. But I think that part of him that was like, no, this is not for me. We've broken away from this nonsense. It really took a hold of him. It's a shame. It's a shame. Because you have to wonder if he had not been influenced by some of these propagandist philosophers of the day and of the past, really. Because to me, it's clear when I'm reading Adams now, it seems to me that he was influenced essentially by propaganda. And it's sad. It's very sad.
Okay, Anthony. I think we've had quite the discussion tonight on this. I think there's probably a lot more to say. I think, as we start to conclude this cast tonight, what are you taking is the important message here? I mean, we do have in America right now that, we're at each other's throats. There's no moral arbiter of truth. There's nobody really to call fair and foul, right and wrong and good and evil, other than a secular Supreme Court. There seems to be no regulating back to the past and tradition. Americans have rebelled at every level based upon their own individual authority. And there seems to be doctrinal, religious, moral chaos in America. Is it fair for us to pin this back on the Founding Fathers because they had a lack of moral order that appears to have naturally sort of gained steam and become even more chaotic? I mean, if, again, I guess if the tree is rotten at the root, what's the top of the tree going to look like, I guess you could say? Is it fair for us to look at the Founding Fathers and say that, possibly all the moral disorder we see in America today was unleashed because of their lack of orthodoxy? Is that fair, Anthony?
I think it's a fair statement, Frank. I think that obviously whether or not they intended for these consequences is another issue. But certainly we can say that the choices they made, we are seeing the results. I think that's highlighted in the fact that they purposely were trying to get away from Catholicism. We see this over and over again. We even see them make mention of Catholicism and its claim that certain things are sins. They didn't like that. But it makes you wonder if they ever considered going over the list of things that the Catholic Church considered sin that they had qualms with, and really reflecting on those things and maybe considering, well, are these things actually sin? So I don't believe they took a critical look at it. They seem to be wrapped up in the philosophical and political propaganda of the day. But I think the last thing that I want to get to here, which highlights this and kind of shows that really Catholics were never going to have a fair shake in this country. And this is the debate in the New York Convention on Religious Toleration. It's from the Journals of the New York Convention, 20th of March, 1777. And this goes back to an amendment John Jay introduced, and it was on the consideration of free toleration of religious profession and worship for everybody, for all mankind, basically, in the United States, or at least within the state of New York. But this is what they're talking about here. But here's the amendment to that. Okay, this is the amendment that John Jay introduces. Quote, except the professors of the religion of the Church of Rome, who ought not to hold lands in or be admitted to a participation of the civil rights enjoyed by the members of this state until such time as the said professors shall appear in the Supreme Court of this state and there most solemnly swear that they verily believe in their conscience that no pope, priest, or foreign authority on earth hath power to absolve the subjects of this state from their allegiance to the same, and further, that they renounce and believe to be false and wicked the dangerous and damnable doctrine that the Pope or any other earthly authority have power to absolve men from sins described in and prohibited by the holy gospel of Jesus Christ, and particularly that no pope, priest, or foreign authority on earth hath power to absolve them from the obligation of this oath. Now, this reminds me very much of the question we asked, well, is it possible that certain forms of government, say, could purposely impede on the Catholic's conscience or free will to exercise their religion? Here we're talking about an oath, taking an oath to the state to go against your own church. Of course, now there was great debate about this, and it wasn't resolved on this day. So, but the very fact that we get, after multiple times this amendment was revised, but we see John Jay's initial thoughts here on paper. And he wasn't alone in this thinking. And it's incredible. He calls it a damnable doctrine. And he's talking specifically about being absolved from sins. What blasphemy. Pure blasphemy.
Yeah, and, the absolution of sins by the priesthood was part of Christendom. It's part of that analogy of the faith that I continue to talk about, that consistent belief through time and space and generation and doctors of the church and the saints and our ancestors, our parents, our grandparents, and our familial lines, right? This is what we all believe up until the Protestant Reformation. And even that in the Catholic world, right? The parts of the world that stay Catholic continue to believe those things. Again, this unbroken line of succession of belief consistent with doctrine and proper and just authority, and ultimately leads us back to Christ. That's why in Catholicism you don't have the anarchy that you see in Protestantism. It's why even to this day it's Catholic nations that are the last bastion of moral truth, because they have proper and just order to a certain respect. Granted, there's a crisis of faith going on all over the globe, including in the church. Don't get me wrong, and there's some nuances there. But for the most part, the church has been consistent for 2,000 years. See, this was, again, the renegotiating terms of condition. You don't like going to a priest because, you know what, you find that a blasphemy of sorts. But that's how the Lord established it in John chapter 20, verse 20 through 22, right before he ascended into heaven. He told his apostles, for those sins you forgive shall be forgiven. For those sins you retain shall be retained. The Bible itself says not only did the apostles and their successors have the right to forgive sins, they had the right to retain sins. Salvation came through the church, an institution like the church that was divinely ordained precisely so orthodoxy could reign, so everybody would not go off kilter and go buck wild into their own interpretive principles and moral anarchy that eventually consumes the Western world. I'll go back to what I said before, Anthony. You look at the state of the culture, the state of the family in the old world. It was healthy. It was vibrant. It was strong. The faith was strong. The family was strong. The culture was strong. You look at the West ever since, well, the Protestant Reformation, obviously, but even more so since the Enlightenment, and we've been a moral disaster, genocide after genocide, the destruction of culture, the destruction of the family, the moral impurities all over the place. We've seen the fruits of this, right? It's just a matter of we're willing to be honest here. This has been a great discussion, my friend, as we've talked about this, the idea of the founding fathers, the founding principles of America. Do the chaotic beliefs of the founding fathers ultimately lead us to an America that's morally bankrupt now, today? I don't see how you can deny it. I just don't see it. I mean, you could try and make your case to me, but I think more, within, the arena of Reeves and what's going to happen is most Americans will ignore this. They will ignore it because nobody wants to come to the truth and the reality of what, again, this analogy of the faith has revealed through our ancestral roots. And again, this 2,000-year analogy of the faith, which has been consistent and has been the backbone of our civilization. What the Catholic world built really essentially for, let's call it 12, 14, 1,600 years. It only took really the Western republics and the liberal thinkers less than 200 years to destroy. See, that's what I find interesting about most of this, is that we're talking about the collapse of Western civilization because it is morally collapsed. It is caving in. Its own principles have failed. Call it the Founding Fathers, call it the Enlightenment thinkers, call it whatever you want. But Catholicism never failed. It was taken down by revolutionary spirits, these revolutionaries that we often refer to. Catholics were murdered and killed. Their empires were taken away, whether it was in the 17th century revolutions or the 18th century revolutions or the 19th century revolution, and even World War I for that matter. This has all come to fruition. I think as Americans, we're all looking around wondering what the heck has happened to our nation. There's no moral sense. And with that comes really the devolution of culture, family, and ultimately the political system. This is why more and more conservatives are losing hope for the future of America. Go no further than the founding principles. There's problems there. Was there some good things there? Yes, there was. But I would argue those good things were borrowed from the Catholic world as well, too. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Anthony, my friend, great discussion tonight. I'm sure we'll have another great topic soon. This is Frank. I want to thank my friend Anthony once again for joining me. Signing off. Good night, everybody.